Michael Carter's heart stopped as the tow truck's hydraulics hissed, his priceless 1,972 Chevelle inches from being hauled away. The woman in the neon tracksuit smirked, phone in hand. "Illegally parked," she said. But this was his driveway, his sanctuary. And she wasn't just stealing his car, she was erasing 3 years of blood, sweat, and resurrection. What started as a confrontation would spiral into a war where vindictive HOA letters turned to gasoline and a box cutter. Michael stood rooted in place, eyes locked on the Chevelle that had once been nothing but a rusted hulk in his father's barn. His father had passed before they could finish the project together, so Michael had poured all his grief and determination into restoring every bolt, every inch of metal. And now a complete stranger in a blindingly green tracksuit was trying to take it from him. "Excuse me," Michael said, stepping forward. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the adrenaline surged in his veins. "That's my car." She turned, crossing her arms. "Not according to the HOA. Classics belong in junkyards or body bags. And yours is illegally parked." Michael shot a glance at the tow truck driver, who looked nervous. The chain was already taut around the Chevelle's front bumper. "You mind telling me how the hell it's illegal to park in my own driveway?" The woman, a neighbor he had never met, laughed softly. "Oh, it's simple. The driveway is shared, so the HOA says you're blocking access. That means I can have it towed." Then she leaned in, voice dripping with condescension. "My name's Nancy, by the way. You should remember it." He stared at her, chest tight. "Lady, this is private property. I have the deed. The city recognizes this driveway as mine alone. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." Nancy rolled her eyes. "We'll see." She snapped her fingers at the tow truck driver, but the poor guy held up his hands. "Ma'am, I need something official," he muttered. "A signed order, or at least..." She thrust a piece of paper at him, covered in what looked like official letterhead. He skimmed it, then frowned. This isn't what I usually get from the HOA. It's missing." "That's because you're dealing with someone who doesn't belong," Michael cut in, stepping between them and the car. "You lift that Chevelle an inch, and it's grand theft auto." The driver's eyes darted from Nancy to Michael. Finally, he shrugged apologetically, removed the chain, and hopped back into the cab. Nancy's face went crimson. "You'll regret this," she hissed. Her phone camera was still rolling, capturing every moment. "I promise." She stormed away. The tow truck rumbled off behind her, leaving Michael with his heart thrumming. He rested a hand on the Chevelle's hood, feeling the warmth of its engine from an earlier drive. Nancy's threat clung to him like a cold wind. He'd hoped that was the end of it, but he had already learned to trust his gut, and his gut told him things were about to get far, far worse. The next day, a note flapped against his door in the morning breeze. Printed on official-looking HOA stationery, it read, "This is your final warning. Remove the unapproved vehicle from the driveway, or further action will be taken. No signature, no contact number, just the sort of vague intimidation tactic people who craved authority would use." Michael almost laughed. He'd done exhaustive research before buying this house specifically to avoid any HOA nonsense. The property lines were crystal clear. So how was she pulling this off? Nancy made sure he knew she was watching. That afternoon, he caught her loitering across the street, arms crossed, bright green tracksuit nearly glowing. She wore the smug expression of someone who believed she ran the neighborhood. Michael stared back, refusing to blink first. Hours later, he installed a security camera above the garage, determined to catch her in the act if she tried anything. By nightfall, he had prepared for petty vandalism, egg on the windshield or nails under the tires. But as the clock inched past 3 a.m., Nancy escalated in a way that made his stomach twist. But peace died at 3:07 a.m., metal screeching as jagged excess tore through 12 layers of hand-buffed lacquer. Michael bolted upright at the sound of his car alarm. He scrambled to the window and peered out at the driveway. A figure hunched near the Chevelle. He raced outside in his boxers, heart thundering. Nancy whirled around at the sight of him, keys in her hand. The overhead lamp revealed fresh, vicious scratches carved into the driver's side door. Michael's hands shook, not from fear, but from the volcanic rage of watching a stranger mutilate the passenger door his late father had helped him weld. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted. The Chevelle's paint job gleamed under the porch light, now defaced by a web of scrapes so deep they exposed bare metal. Nancy smirked. "Consider it a warning. You can't keep ignoring the rules." She strolled off, leaving Michael to stare at the carnage. Every muscle in his body screamed to chase her down, but he forced himself to check the damage. The marks spanned nearly the entire panel. 3 years of careful restoration undone by one petty act of cruelty. He darted inside for his phone, yanked up the security camera app, and watched the footage. There she was, Nancy creeping onto his driveway, glancing around, then pressing her key so hard it nearly bent, each metallic screech carving the word mine into his bones. The police arrived within the hour. Michael showed them the video. One officer shook his head. That's blatant vandalism. You want to press charges? Absolutely, Michael said, his voice taut. He had no intention of backing down. All right, the officer replied. We'll file a report, see what we can do. As the patrol car pulled away, Michael gazed at the Chevelle's battered door. His father's memory was in every rivet, every swirl of paint. He touched the grooves with trembling fingertips. Nancy wanted to fight. She'd just made it personal. Early the next morning, more letters plastered his windshield. Notice of violation. Your vehicle is in non-compliance. A fine of $500 will be imposed if it is not removed within 48 hours. She was relentless, and for no reason. That was what gnawed at him the most. Why target him? Why pretend the HOA had control over a property that sat outside its borders? But when the HOA fines kept coming, Michael realized this wasn't petty revenge. It was a blueprint, one she'd used to vanish 3 families before him. He dug deeper, talking to neighbors who looked at him with pity or outright fear when he asked about Nancy. An elderly man 2 blocks away confessed that Nancy had slapped him with bogus noise complaints until he finally moved out. A family with kids said they'd been threatened for letting bicycles clutter the sidewalk. One by one they had caved or fled. Michael refused. He'd spent too many nights in that garage with a wrench in his hand, replaying old memories of his father teaching him how to sand metal or install a new carburetor. This house was his fortress. Nobody was towing his heritage away. Yet Nancy's next stunt almost succeeded. He had gone to pick up groceries one afternoon, gone maybe 40 minutes. When he turned onto his street, his stomach lurched at the sight of another tow truck in his driveway. The Chevelle was already hitched, front tires lifted off the ground. Michael slammed his sedan into park, jumped out, and practically sprinted across the lawn. Put it down, he bellowed. Nancy stood beside the truck, arms folded. She wore a bright grin that didn't touch her eyes. It's for your own good, she said. We can't have your junker lowering our property values. The HOA gave the order. Michael yanked open the truck door, startling the driver. Check the paperwork, he growled, voice low. I guarantee you it's fake. The driver flipped through a small stack of forms. As his face paled, he mumbled, These aren't signed or stamped. Ma'am, you said. Unhook it, Michael demanded, stepping between Nancy and the truck. Now. Nancy's lips thinned. Fine, she snapped. But the next time you park that rust bucket wrong, it's gone. Then, under her breath, You don't belong here. He glared back. I belong in my own driveway, he said. You come near my car again, you'll regret it. She tried to maintain her composure, but as the chains dropped and the Chevelle's tires hit the ground, Michael saw humiliation in her eyes. By nightfall, the tension pulsed through the street like a live wire. Michael had sharpened the home security more. He installed additional motion sensors that triggered lights in the driveway. If Nancy tried anything, she'd be bathed in floodlight. But Nancy's men showed up instead. Michael had just drifted off when an alert on his phone jolted him awake. Motion detected. The live feed showed 2 men stepping onto his driveway. One gripped a crowbar, the other a baseball bat. Nancy, visible at the edge of the screen, pointed at the Chevelle with a triumphant grin. Michael's breath hitched. They weren't trying to tow it. They were here to destroy it. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling with urgency. They're about to wreck my car. Send someone now. He sprinted downstairs, yanked the front door open. But by the time he got outside, the men had already swung the crowbar. The windshield shattered, a spiderweb of glass caving in. Hey, Michael roared, get away from. Before he could finish, the baseball bat slammed into the side mirror. Metal and plastic skidded across the driveway. Nancy stood back, her face distorted by the swirl of conflicting streetlights, but unmistakably giddy. She was orchestrating a personal demolition derby right in front of his home. The men turned on him, but the sudden wash of red and blue lights froze them in place. 2 police cars shrieked to a stop, officers bolting out with guns drawn. Nancy's men dropped their weapons and fled. One made it to the back fence. The other was tackled near the curb. Nancy, realizing the danger too late, tried to run but slipped on shattered glass. She scrambled to her feet as an officer closed in. She pointed at Michael. "He's the criminal. That car violates the—" The officer wasn't having it. "On the ground. Hands behind your head now." Nancy landed face first on the pavement, spitting curses. Michael's hands curled into fists at the carnage. His beloved Chevelle was battered beyond belief. Windshield gone, door panels caved, side mirror dangling from a single screw. His late father's legacy battered under a wave of manufactured hatred. Police arrested Nancy on the spot for vandalism, conspiracy, and trespassing. Michael provided the security footage, and that sealed the deal. But her triumphant sneer never fully vanished as they led her into a squad car. Michael woke up the next morning to a new letter taped to his door. Another HOA notice. Another fine. The gall was almost impressive. He rolled his eyes, crumpled the paper, and called the HOA directly. A woman named Linda answered. "Hello, this is Linda with the—" He cut in. "I have a property outside HOA borders. I keep getting your fines anyway. Does the name Nancy ring a bell?" Linda sighed. "We're aware of the situation, sir." "Then why is she using your letterhead?" he demanded. "She's in jail for vandalizing my car, but I'm still getting these so-called notices. I want an explanation." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Sir, the board received multiple complaints from Nancy. She told us you were a habitual violator. We had no idea about the rest." Michael nearly laughed. "Well, now you do. Unless you want a lawsuit, I expect a statement clearing my name and a ceasefire on these nonsense fines." Linda mumbled a flurry of apologies and hung up. Hours later, Michael got an email from the HOA board disclaiming any connection to Nancy's actions. They were, apparently, reviewing the matter internally. He suspected they were scrambling to cover themselves from any legal blowback. But Nancy wasn't done. Even from behind bars, she pulled strings. A few days later, as Michael was polishing the few undamaged spots on the Chevelle, he noticed he wasn't alone. A man stood across the street, wearing a hoodie. He just stared. When Michael straightened to look at him, the man vanished around the corner. That night, the phone started ringing at odd hours. Always no caller ID. Always silence on the other end. One ring at 3 a.m., then a hang-up, then another at 3:15, another at 3:30. By the time dawn broke, Michael hadn't slept a wink. He scoured the street again, found nothing, and tried to chalk it up to random hooligans. But the next morning, he got a text from a neighbor who had discovered slash marks on their tires. Another neighbor found raw meat stuffed in their mailbox. Notes, all typed in the same threatening tone, popped up on front doors across the block. "You helped him. This is your fault." A single mother on the corner told Michael her kids had seen two men lurking near her backyard fence. The more he asked around, the more he uncovered the same pattern. Intimidation, property damage, ominous warnings that Nancy would be back soon. Michael realized if he didn't stop them, half the neighborhood would flee the way so many others had before. Nancy might be in jail, but her nephews or friends were out here, continuing her twisted reign. He refused to let them win. One night, he heard the unmistakable hiss of an aerosol can outside his window. Racing onto his porch, he found two silhouettes scrawling something across the Chevelle's hood. He flipped the floodlights on just in time to see them vanish into the darkness, leaving behind a chaotic smear of black paint. He clenched his jaw. Enough. He decided he would set a trap, place the Chevelle out front, rig the cameras and motion sensors, and wait. If Nancy's cronies were determined to finish what she'd started, he'd meet them head-on. He set up new infrared cameras with real-time phone alerts. The moment they stepped foot on his property, the cameras would ping him, and he'd call the police, or handle it himself if needed. That night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., his phone buzzed. Intruder alert. Two men, again. One cradled a gas can, the other held a baseball bat. Through the feed, Michael saw them creeping toward the Chevelle's battered frame, clearly intending to torch it once and for all. Michael sprinted downstairs and grabbed his own baseball bat from the closet. The sweat on his palms felt ice cold. No time to wait for the cops. He flung the front door open, floodlights exploding with blinding brilliance. The men froze, deer in headlights. "Get away from my car," Michael growled, voice carrying across the driveway. For a second, nobody moved. Then the one with the bat bolted, vaulting the fence. But the one with the gas can hesitated, scrambling to unscrew the spout. Michael sprinted forward, kicking the container out of his grip. Gas splattered onto the pavement. Sirens wailed in the distance. The intruder glanced around in panic. Two squad cars whipped around the corner, red and blue lighting up the silent houses. Officers jumped out, guns drawn. "On the ground," they shouted. "Hands behind your head." The man flattened himself, trembling. The second intruder was found a few blocks away, cowering behind a dumpster. Both were arrested on the spot. Later at the station, Michael learned their names: Jason and Eric, Nancy's nephews. They confessed everything. Nancy had called them from jail, urging them to defend her reputation by harassing Michael until he either sold his house or gave up the Chevelle. She didn't care which. She wanted him gone. Now the police had all the proof they needed: recorded phone calls, text messages, plus the list of neighborhoods Nancy had targeted before: tampering with a witness, conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, and a litany of other charges. Nancy's 6-month sentence ballooned into 5 years. Her nephews took plea deals, testifying that Nancy had orchestrated every bit of the terror spree from behind bars. She was done. No more early release, no chance of a quiet comeback. At last, the neighborhood could breathe. But the wounds still ran deep. People who had tolerated Nancy's bullying for years suddenly realized they didn't have to. A father down the street proudly hung an American flag Nancy once tried to ban. A family decorated their yard with pink flamingos. Dozens of them. The flamingos multiplying on lawns weren't just decor, they were battle flags. And as the HOA's apology letter crumpled in Michael's fist, he finally understood. Some legacies aren't built in garages. They're forged in the moments ordinary men decide to stop being polite. The HOA, panicked over the bad publicity, held an emergency meeting. Michael attended only out of curiosity, half expecting them to blame everything on one rogue neighbor. Instead, the board members issued a mass apology to all affected homeowners, voided any fines Nancy had placed, and reimbursed those she had scammed. Michael sat in the back, watching as neighbors, some shaking with anger, others with relief, told stories of Nancy's intimidation. The HOA president promised stricter protocols: no more random fines without official letters and signatures, open book policy meetings, clear channels to dispute any questionable complaint. Time would tell if they truly changed, but at least the promises were a step in the right direction. One afternoon, while Michael was buffing out the last paint blemish on the Chevelle, a delivery guy handed him a letter from the district attorney's office. Nancy had pleaded guilty. 5 years in prison with no parole. Her house was sold at auction to pay for damages. She'd tried one last Hail Mary by filing a defamation lawsuit against Michael, but that had been laughed out of court. He exhaled, leaning against the Chevelle's fender. The memory of seeing Nancy with that box cutter, carving scratches into metal he and his father had spent so many hours perfecting, still made his jaw clench. But now it was over. Truly over. "Hey neighbor," Tom, the older man who lived next door, called from across the fence. He lifted a beer in salute. "Heard the good news. Nancy's gone for good. How's it feel?" Michael studied the fresh paint job on the Chevelle. "Like I'm finally breathing clean air." Tom grinned, ambled over, and offered Michael a cold can. They stood in comfortable silence. No roar of tow trucks, no tension sizzling beneath the surface, just a quiet sense of triumph. "You know," Tom said, tapping the Chevelle's hood, "that woman nearly destroyed this car." Michael nodded. "This car's more than steel and wheels. It's a piece of my family." His father guiding his hand on a wrench, voice warm and encouraging. "Nobody's taking that away from me." Tom patted his shoulder. "You're tougher than she realized." Michael took a sip of beer, the carbonation stinging his tongue. She tried to turn the HOA into her own private militia, but all she did was unite everyone against her. He gestured down the street, where a cluster of neighbors was laughing around someone's newly painted mailbox. The sense of relief was palpable. Their fear had evaporated. Nancy's intimidation had backfired, forging stronger friendships than ever before. A week later, the HOA sent a final note, this time an olive branch rather than a fine. Inside was a check for $10,000 to help cover the Chevelle's repairs, along with an official letter stating Michael was exempt from any future HOA dues should the neighborhood's boundaries expand. He stared at it for a long moment, letting out a dry laugh. He didn't really need their money. His insurance had covered most of the damage, and he'd done the paintwork himself. But the principle of the thing, having them acknowledge they were complicit in letting Nancy run rampant, felt like a victory. He tucked the letter away. The check could go toward new tires or a better security system. Another letter arrived soon after, scrawled in angry pen strokes. No return address, but he knew exactly who it was from. "I hope you're happy. You ruined everything I built. That neighborhood was mine. You're a nobody. Enjoy your victory, it won't last." Michael skimmed it, then tore it in half. Nancy was out of moves. She couldn't threaten him from a prison cell. She had no allies left, not after her nephews turned on her in court. The only thing she had was her spite, and that was powerless now. He dropped the scraps into the trash, returning to his driveway where the Chevelle shone under the afternoon sun, flawless once again. He ran his hand along the hood, exhaling. The old heartbreak over his father's passing felt different now, more peaceful. He'd preserved his father's handiwork, refused to let a petty tyrant destroy it. That weekend, the neighborhood organized a long-overdue block party, something Nancy would never have allowed. Grills smoked, kids chased each other with water balloons, and the pink flamingos on one lawn had multiplied into a proud army of tacky defiance. When Michael arrived, Tom beckoned him over to a fold-out table laden with food. "Grab a burger, you've earned it," Tom said. Others chimed in with laughter and thanks. Families Michael barely knew offered him plates of homemade cookies, a slice of pie, or a cold drink. Their gratitude was genuine. By refusing to back down, he'd unknowingly given everyone else permission to stand up too. He accepted a paper plate loaded with barbecue. The tension that had once hung over the entire neighborhood was gone. He could see it in the teased each other, invited one another over without fear of a violation notice stuck to their door the next day. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, kids ran around with glow sticks, and the hum of conversation lulled into a warm hush. Tom nudged Michael's shoulder. "You ever think about running for HOA president?" he joked. Michael nearly choked on a sip of lemonade. "Absolutely not." They laughed, and for a moment Michael just stood there, feeling the weight of all that had happened. The anger, the fear, the heartbreak, and the final victory. The Chevelle had survived. He had survived. Nancy was gone. He spotted those plastic flamingos again and smiled. They represented a neighborhood's collective stand against petty tyrants, bright, obnoxious, and